Philosophy in the Middle Ages. That is a new period in the history of Western philosophy. We call it medieval philosophy. And medieval philosophy emerged in the late Roman Empire from a mutual accommodation of Christian belief and classical ancient thought. So medieval philosophy is a complex of philosophical teachings, doctrines, traditions that formed at the intersection of philosophy and theology. And in fact, there wasn't any professional boundary between philosophers and theologians. Nevertheless, we're talking about the philosophical ideas that form the basis for the development of philosophical and theological doctrines as well. Because theologians used lots of categories and principles and forms of argument invented by the philosophers in order to contribute to the further development of their theological doctrines. That means that, anyway, this philosophical tradition, the medieval philosophical tradition, it emerged and developed on the basis of the meeting of at least two trends. First one is ancient philosophical classics, which was perceived as legacy of the pagan philosophy, and religious monotheistic doctrine, which was spread in European countries, and this religious doctrine completely changed the worldview, and it contributed to the development of a new type of culture with a new set of categories, with a new set of values, with a rather original understanding of the structure of the universe. You know, philosophy is an epoch which is grasped in thought, according to Hegel. And philosophy seeks to obtain comprehension of the principles of the dominant view of the world and of the predominating value orientations. So, you know, the Middle Ages are characterized by the traditionalism, by the feudal system of social relations, and by the leading role of the religious principles of spiritual culture. And that is what is specific to the medieval intellectual tradition. So the European culture in the Middle Ages is characterized by, by the predominance of religious values, views, and ideologies. And you know, the core of the dominant values and views was determined by the adoption and spread of Christian religious beliefs and the establishment of Christian religious doctrine, which was assumed to be a universally meaningful doctrine. And as I tell, the medieval philosophy was a mixture of these two major ingredients. The Greek philosophical heritage, which was processed, reconsidered, and adapted to a new type of discourse, specifically theological discourse, and Christianity. And I'd like to know that all the Greek philosophers, including the so-called New-Platonists, they exerted their influence on Latin philosophy and on Greek philosophy as well, because, you know, there are two alternative traditions. Ancient Greek-speaking world, which goes back to Alexandria, to Athens, and a new and a Roman world with its Latin tradition. So there are two trends in philosophical discourse. The first one is represented by Greek philosophers and theologians, and the second one is mainly represented by Latin theological authors. Nevertheless, there is an integrity of ideas, and there is an integrity of the trends of thought in medieval philosophy. Christian doctrine was the most essential ingredient of medieval view and philosophy. That is a religious element. It may seem odd to adopt this religious element because philosophy essentially examines all the assumptions, and religion is something which is taken for granted, which is a matter of faith. And it seemed that there must have been a conflict between philosophy and religion. Nevertheless, for instance, we can just transform the view of the relation between ideology, religion on the one hand, and philosophy and the discipline of critical thinking on the other hand. And we can think of, for instance, religious doctrine as providing some axioms or the basis for the further philosophical inquiries as the first premises out of which all the other truths can be deduced. That anyway, even Aristotle recognized the fact that the foundations of science, something which is axiomatic, they can be a matter of that which is subjected to any proof. The premises or axioms should be grasped by the intellect. These premises form the object of noetic understanding. Now we address this noetic understanding as a kind of intellectual intuition. So in order to, for instance, develop arguments, we have to accept certain premises. In order to apply the model of deduction, we have to accept something as the basis for our deductive reasoning. In order to give proof of something, we should accept a certain conceptual framework. So religious doctrines, they provided these frameworks and foundations for the further theological reflections, and philosophy played a certain functional role in the development of the theological discourse. Anyway, so Christian institutions sustained medieval intellectual life, and Christianity's texts and ideas provide rich subject matter for philosophical reflection as well as theological inquiry. And medieval philosophy began when philosophers began to measure their speculations against theological doctrine, and it ended when philosophers stopped doing that. The dominant role of a religious view of the world, religious spirituality, it influenced the formation of the intellectual climate of the spirit of this epoch. There is a set of disciplines which now are referred to as Studia Divinitatis. And Studia Divinitatis, there is a set of special systematic studies of theological questions. Studia Divinitatis were of high importance to medieval thinkers. The study of theological questions, theological disputations, they were really of primary importance. But theologians relied on philosophy, on philosophical categories, on philosophical arguments, and they also adopted the strategies of philosophical thinking to their theological approaches aimed at resolving specific theological problems. Theologians, apologists, scholastics, they were preoccupied with examination, clarification, and interpretation of Holy Scripture and orthodox texts. They worked at dogmatic formulas. They searched for the best ways of understanding of these formulas. And some of the principles of the religious doctrine were subject to explication and demonstration in order to make the understanding of those principles more clear, in order to make the content of the doctrine more intelligible. And as I've told, there was no professional or disciplinary boundary between theology and philosophy. And the major theologians of the age, they were also philosophers, those who relied on the knowledge of philosophy. And theologians, especially scholastics, couldn't do without philosophy. They were aware of ancient intellectual tradition, although they treated it with ambiguity because it was a kind of pagan tradition. It was associated with pagan pre-Christian culture, and some of the ancient philosophical conceptions were rejected as totally incompatible with Christian doctrine. But some ideas were treated with critical consideration and even appreciated as if those philosophical ideas contained some seeds of wisdom, of true wisdom, the signs of intuitive grasp of the truth of divine revelation, found in some of the writings of Plato, for instance. Yet, in the Middle Ages, theologians and philosophers, they made distinction between those things that can be known through the unaided reason and those things that can only be known through a supernatural revelation. So, and the very term philosophy came to be synonymous with knowledge attained by the natural light of reason. And philosophy is not synonymous with all knowledge. Philosophy, even with this limitation, covers both the physical and moral sciences. Nevertheless, anyway, it is associated with a set of disciplines which encompass knowledge attained by the natural light of reason. And it is distinct from that which is given due to the revelation. The truths of revelation fixed in Holy Scriptures, they were taken as axiomatic foundations for the further reasoning. Nevertheless, we have to be precise in defining the functional status of philosophy in the Middle Ages. First of all, the first thesis is that philosophy had turned out to be the efficient instrument of theological rationalization of the religious doctrine. That is the function of philosophy, to rationalize the content of religious doctrine. Philosophical ideas, categories, and arguments have been subjected to critical reconsideration, but they were adapted for the purpose of the progressive development and theoretical elaboration of the religious doctrine. The medieval thinkers philosophized because they wished to understand Christianity, and there is a well-known formula introduced by Anselm of Canterbury, theologian and philosopher of the 11th century. Anselm of Canterbury proclaimed, "Fides quaerens intellectum," that means faith seeking understanding. And Anselm's phrase is a perfect description of the role of philosophy. A major part of the task of philosophy is that of just glorification and demonstration, that glorification of some of the truth of Christianity, and demonstration that Christianity is not incompatible with what can be demonstrated by reason, at least. For the medieval thinkers, it was crucially important to establish that Christianity wasn't incompatible in the proposition demonstrated by philosophy, because that was a matter of just spreading knowledge among those who haven't still adopted this new religious doctrine. Nevertheless, we should be aware of the fundamental transformations of the view of the world that were brought about by the adoption and spread of Christianity in Europe. There are universals of the medieval religious view of the world, and among these universals, the fundamental one is the principle of monotheocentrism. What is monotheocentrism? It is the recognition of the fact that the fundamental reality is the reality of God. It is the ultimate reality. In fact, to be fully real is to be substance, and God is a substance. It is just the ipsum esse, the being in itself. So you just recall the insights of Aristotle as they were articulated in his Metaphysics. God is absolute and transcendent, and it is true being. It is not contingent being. It is absolute being, ipsum esse, being in itself. It is the nature of being, and the term being is appropriately used in order to refer to God, because God's essence and existence, they coincide, and being is the source of everything which is real. But God is thought of as a person, one in three persons. Yeah, one in three persons, and that is a real innovation in the religious mind. Creationism, that's another principle of medieval worldview. The creation of the world by God out of nothing. And this principle seems to be incompatible with the principle of the sufficient reason, which was highly appreciated by ancient Greeks. And this idea of just creating the world out of nothing, it falls out of the theoretical and rational understanding of the ancients. Nevertheless, creationism is something which can be taken philosophically, and that means that the ontological status of this world is, to a certain extent, is relative. I mean that the being of this world is a contingent one, that the world doesn't exist on its own. The world exists insofar it is somehow created and sustained by God at every instant of its existence. That means that there is no place for an ontological foundation of the world in the world itself. There must be some ontological foundation, the cause for the existence of the world, which doesn't belong to the world itself, which is transcendent to the world. So the world exists insofar things in this world, they participate in being. And it is God who is the source of being, the source of reality. And these are the implications of the idea of creationism. God's existence is something which is necessary. The existence of this world is a contingent one. Dualism, that's another interesting aspect of medieval view of the world. The dualism of the earthly created and heavenly divine being. There is an ontological difference between the world created cosmic reality and the transcendent sacred divine reality of God and other creatures that are close to God. The idea of the hierarchical structure of the universe. Hierarchy can be seen in nature and in society. It corresponds to the feudal hierarchy in the feudal society. But also there is a hierarchy of the divine ranks. And some innovations that were brought into the intellectual culture of humanity by Christianity. First of all, it's personalism. The concept of personality. Ancients were not acquainted with the concept of personality. They perceived a human being as an individual, as a citizen, but actually they never perceived a human being as a unique person. Man as a personality, and this element, personality, is constituted by the relation of man, unique relation of his or her soul to the Creator, to God. Man as a personality is created after the image of the divine personality. And it is expected, a human being is expected to attain the state of similarity to the divine personal prototype. Just recall Plato and the language of Platonic philosophy. Plato used such concepts as eidos, and this concept is also semantically related and etymologically related to the well-known concept of eikon, or image. So And that is our fundamental existential task, to enhance ourselves as persons, to obtain the state of the purification of the divine imprint in our personality, because that is what constitutes our personality, our unique individuality, and what determines our personal destiny, our relation to our Creator. The fact that we are all created in the image of God, and God is personality. And we are exposed to God as persons, not merely just as impersonal individuals. We are personally responsible. We are personally responsible for what we are doing in life, for how we use our abilities. Universalism, that's another interesting innovation. The recognition of the fundamental ontological unity of human nature and the commonality of the earthly destiny of human race. We are all equal in our standing before the Almighty God. Historism, that's another very important innovation. The idea of the linear reality of time. Time now is introduced as a linear process. And with this historism and providentialism, the idea of progress enters the mind of European humanity. Because at the end of the history, there is the crucial point, eschato, that is called the end of the history. Eschatologism is one of the essential attitudes of a religious medieval view of the world. Providentialism and eschatologism as the specifications of the historism. Revelationism, divine revelation as the source of knowledge, the knowledge of sacred truths. And this source is different from that of the source of some other truths which are accessible to us due to the natural light of reason. Symbolism, we can identify some symbolic meanings of some real events. We can read the signs, we can read the magical book of nature, comprehending nature's the artifact. And we can also know the signs that can be attended in the events of our life, and try to just understand our destiny. And soteriology, the doctrine of the redemption and salvation and transfiguration of our nature, just stepping on the road to the blessed reunion with the Creator. That's the ultimate goal. Transfiguring our nature with the help of God and moving forward to the blessed reunion with God as the Creator. Consider the periods of medieval philosophy. Traditionally, medieval philosophy is structured according to the distinction between the earliest period and the latest period. We use specific terms in order to denote this period. The first term is patristics. The term patristics covers activities by the early Christian writers. Patristic writers are originally so named because they were considered the fathers of the Orthodox Christian churches. But there were some non-Orthodox thinkers, such as Origen, for example, that were really influential and contributed to the medieval culture, philosophy, and theology. Nevertheless, we use this term patristic as a kind of umbrella term, covering all those schools associated with early Christian thought. And we refer to orthodox and heterodox thinkers who were active in the first 6 centuries of the Christian era. The second period is addressed as the period of the so-called scholastic philosophy. It is a set of doctrines, instructional techniques, theological and philosophical schools that developed in Western Europe from the 11th up to the 15th century Anno Domini. And consider 6 main characteristics of scholasticism, because now we treat scholasticism as a kind of intellectual formation, as a kind of model of rational discourse. Scholasticism was based on the acceptance of the prevailing orthodoxy. Beside that, the spread of the new translations of the text of Aristotle were of great importance. And Aristotle was recognized as a thinker which was really great, even than Plato. Though Plato was a really influential thinker, and Plato was recognized by the first Christian theologians, though not all the texts of Plato were accessible on some of the dialects, and among these dialects, Thymius was one of the influential sources for the early medieval thought. The prominence, giving prominence to dialectical thinking and syllogistic reasoning, of course, that was the influence of Aristotle's works on logic. An acceptance of the distinction between natural and revealed theology, that was another feature of theology, scholastic discourse, and tendency to dispute everything at a great length and in a minute detail. The analysis of concepts, the development of arguments, attention to the linguistic means, to the use of the terms of language and verbal expressions in order to articulate position states. That is what had formed the basis for the scientific culture, though it may seem paradoxical, but nevertheless. The culture of rational discourse and argumentation was of really great importance for the subsequent development of intellectual tradition of the Western Europe. Prominent figures of the medieval philosophy. First of all, Augustine, Aurelius Augustine, was one of the prominent Latin fathers of church. He was one of the most influential figures in the early medieval period of philosophy. And Augustine was influenced by Platonic tradition, and he applied Plato's thinking to Christianity. And Augustine represents the apex of the Latin patristic tradition. Boethius, that is a thinker of the 5th, 6th century, is highly appreciated for the translation and commentary of Aristotle's logical works, and this shaped much the Latin technical philosophical vocabulary. And you know, just in our days, we also use some of the terms that were coined by Boethius on the basis of the translation of the original Greek terms. For instance, substance, subject, object, supposition, predicate, and lots of other terms that were introduced and built into the structure and apparatus of philosophical language due to the translations of classical Asian texts. Anselm of Canterbury, known for his ontological argument. Anselm of Canterbury, theologian of the 11th century. He is also known as the father of classical scholasticism. Then Peter Abelard, a theologian and philosopher who operated in the 11th, 12th centuries, and he contributed greatly to the dialectics. He elaborated a set of interesting arguments in the scholastic debate over the problem of universals. And of course, Thomas Aquinas is one of the most influential medieval thinkers. He's the 13th century theologian who reconciled Christianity with Aristotelian framework, and who transformed Aristotelian metaphysics into the foundation of the Christian system of theology and philosophy. And specifically, he used some of the refined Aristotelian concepts in order to develop a metaphysical system which set a model for the scholastic reasoning. The analysis of the metaphysical problems was the precondition and the prerequisite for the elaboration of specific theological problems, giving proof of the fact that God is one, using such concepts as essence and existence in order to argue for the fact that God is one because essence and existence coincide, and that is the nature of God, that there is no place for any real distinction between essence and existence, and so on. Also, Duns Scotus, that an opponent to Aquinas, William of Ockham, a famous nominalist thinker of the 14th century, who shaped the theological discourse due to the application of some new tools of logic, and who also contributed to the establishment of the doctrine of the double truth, the truth of theology and philosophy that shouldn't be somehow mixed with each other. And so he separated the truth of theology from the truth of philosophy, the rational discourse from that of theological inquiry. And Francisco Suarez, the latest theologian who belonged to this scholastic tradition, he systematized some of the scholastic doctrines in 17th century. We know that 17th century tradition associated with modern age, but nevertheless, some of the intellectuals of the age, as Francisco Suarez, operated, and they continued to sustaining this theological tradition which goes back to classical scholasticism. Okay, let's turn to patristic philosophy. As I told you, patristic philosophy covers activities of the early Christian writers. Some of them were recognized as thinkers who formed the basis for the orthodox, true, genuine, original Christian doctrine. They were recognized as the fathers of the church, paters. In order to be regarded as a father of the church, a Christian author must show orthodoxy of teaching. Orthodoxy of teaching means that, of course, there can be mistakes in doctrine, but the doctrine developed by a certain theologian is compatible with the fundamental dogmatic formulas established by the religious community. Holiness of life, that's a practical aspect. Nevertheless, not all the fathers have the title saint, but holiness of life is one of the attributes of a typical father of church, and of course approval by the church and antiquity. we can discriminate even between different periods in the history of this patristic philosophy. The earliest period is called the age of the apologists. The age of the apologists. Apology means just providing defense and justification of Christian doctrine. So the use of philosophy by the early Greek Christian authors can be divided into these three periods. The first period is associated with the beginnings, rather the 1st and 2nd century, Anno Domini, in which ideas derived from Platonism, from Stoicism. Stoicism was a really influential school of the late Hellenistic age, and skepticism. They were employed for the apologetic purposes, to defend and justify Christian doctrine. Some of those things were also influenced by Hellenistic Judaism. The second period is associated with the so-called Alexandrian school of philosophy and theology. The Alexandrian period is the period during which Middle Platonism and Stoicism were dominant. And this can be clearly seen in the doctrines of Clement Alexandria and Origen. Origen as a non-orthodox thinker, heterodox thinker. Clement of Alexandria was an orthodox thinker. Clement of Alexandria lived in the 2nd, 3rd centuries, and he was a formative teacher in the early Christian church. And he combined enthusiasm for Greek philosophy with the defense of the church's faith. And he espoused spiritual and intellectual assent toward that complete but hidden knowledge or gnosis reserved for the truly enlightened. And he founded a school of theology. Now we address it as the Alexandrian School of Theology. For Clement of Alexandria, philosophy among the pagans was a pedagogical preparation for Christ. And in the figure of Jesus Christ, Logos, arisen, had become enfleshed, and philosophers now should rise above their inferior understanding to the perfect knowledge revealed in Christ. That means that philosophy was treated as the preparation for the subsequent adoption of the truth of Christianity, and that was a kind of rehabilitation of the ancient classical tradition of philosophy. Origen, that was another Christian theologian, biblical scholar in the Alexandrian church. He was born in Egypt and he became head of the catechetical school in Alexandria. He was influenced by Middle Platonism, and his principal works were Hexapla on First Principles, Contra Celsum, and other works. The most influential among the works of Origen was the treatise entitled On First Principles. It sets forth the most systematic Christian theology of the early church, including some doctrines subsequently declared heretical, such as the subordination of the Son, a secondary God, and Spirit to the Father, or the idea of the pre-existing human souls, as if they pre-existed and then they just come out to be separated from God and enfleshed. And the pre-mundane fall from grace of each human soul. Also, he is a thinker who is well known for his contribution to the development of the doctrine of apokatastasis, a universal salvation, the universal restoration of all creation to God, in which evil is defeated and the devil and his minions repent of their sins. So he interpreted hell as a temporary purgatory in which impure souls were purified and made ready for heaven. But, Origen articulated some of the ideas that later were developed by the so-called New Platonists. And his concept of subordination of the Son of God to the Father was condemned by the Church, because subordinationalism is not compatible with Orthodox views of established as a kind of dogmatic formula by the Fathers of Church. And the third period, the development of Christian New Platonism, first under the influence of Porphyry and later under the influence of Proclus. There were influential figures such as Pseudo-Dionysius Areopagitus, who rose to a position of great prominence in subsequent Christian traditions of Neoplatonizing mystical theory and practice. Latin patristics reached the highest point of its development in theology and philosophy of Aurelius Augustine. And now we're going to turn to Augustine and to examine some of his ideas. Augustine, or Saint Augustine, also known as Aurelius Augustine. Augustine was one of the key figures in the transition from antiquity to the Middle Ages. He was born in the north of Africa, in the city of Tagaste, and he was a son of Monica, his mother, who was a devout Christian. Maybe that was the influence of his mother, that later on he adopted Christianity. But Augustine initially received a classical education. First, he studied in the local grammar school, then in a high school nearby Madaura, and finally under the patronage of a local noble named Romanianus, he studied at the university in Carthage. So he was a really sophisticated, well-educated man, and Augustine's education was almost entirely literary. He loved Latin literature. He was fond of reading ancient texts such as that of Cicero, for instance. And he searched for wisdom. And his search for wisdom led him first to a syncretic philosophical religious system of Manichaeism. Manichaeism was a religion born in Mesopotamia in the 3rd century AD. It's found that Mani taught a form of dualism influenced by early Gnostics. According to the doctrine of Manichaeism, God is opposed by forces of darkness. And these forces, not God, create human beings. But God, nonetheless, inputs some particles of light. And these particles of light can be released by abstemious living. So over time, Augustine became increasingly convinced that this Manichaean doctrine, which allowed for the existence of evil as a substance, wasn't only unsatisfying, but it was also untenable. Nevertheless, later on he addressed this problem, the problem of the reality of evil. I think that he looked back to his adherence to some of the ideas of Manichaeism, and he opposed to Manichaeism, as we shall see. He claimed that we are not justified in thinking of evil as a substance, as a reality. There is no place for evil in reality. Evil is a kind of privation of God, and that is the prerequisite for the resolution of the fundamental problem of theodicea, or the justification of God, because how to justify God in the face of those evil which we encounter in our life. God is something which is absolutely good. How to reconcile absolute goodness of God with the evil which exists in the world. So Augustine showed that in fact we are mistaken when we think of evil as something real, and we are personally responsible for that which is called evil, because we have free will. Then Augustine took seriously the views of academic skeptics. And this period he believed that wisdom is unattainable, and that the best intellectual course for him was to withhold trying to find the ultimate answers to philosophical and theological questions. You know, the famous René Descartes' argument, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, is similar to the argument of Augustine. Augustine developed his argument that if I can be mistaken about lots of things, but if I'm mistaken, therefore I am. So, anyway, something must be certain to a person, and our own existence can be known with certainty, and the same point is the starting point for René Descartes. Our own existence and the transparency of our own mind. Augustine moved to Milan, and in Milan he encountered Ambrose, Milan's charismatic bishop, and he fell under the influence of Ambrose. And Augustine gained some knowledge of the Platonist philosophy, but actually he got acquainted with the ideas of Platonics due to the texts of new Platonists. Plotinus and Porphyry were the so-called new Platonists. They transformed the doctrine of Plato into a system of philosophy. They recognized that there must be something which is the source of realities, one, which is supernatural. They call it one. And all things, they emanate out of one. And there are a succession of the phases of emanation. The first phase is denoted as being or mind. The next phase of the emanation of one is denoted as soul. So mind and soul, these are supernatural realities, and these are realities that should be conceived of as the phases of the emanation of the supernatural one, which is not accessible to our mind. It's only accessible to those who are capable of obtaining the state of super-intelligent ecstasis. And the soul permeates the universe. So the goal of a human just to find his or her path to the one. There is an interesting doctrine. To a certain extent, this Neoplatonic doctrine influenced maybe the modes of thinking of early Christian authors. Just we can make comparison, for instance, with the doctrine of God as Trinity. Father, there's a kind of similarity between God as Father and the One, which is mystical, which exists over and above. The second phase of the emanation of the One in Neoplatonist doctrine, nous, or mind, it is equivalent to Platonic world of ideal forms. And according to Christians, the second personality is that of Jesus Christ, who sometimes is referred to as Logos, as kind of something rational, Logos. According to Neoplatonists, the third phase, the next phase of emanation of the One is that of soul, and there is a correlation between this, the idea of this third phase, and the idea of Holy Spirit. I think that Origen, as I told you, adopted this doctrine to Christianity, but in fact, this doctrine was rejected because it assumes subordination of the persons of Holy Trinity to the Father. According to the official dogmatic formula, they are all equal and have one and the same essence. Nevertheless, this Neoplatonic doctrine, the doctrine of the emanation of all things are one, was influenced the mind of Augustine, and the works of Neoplatonics help him to think about the nature of God and the problem of evil. Maybe that was the first stage of his enlightenment or illumination, and this led him straight forward to a form of intellectual Christianity. Augustine was converted to Christianity and he was baptized in 387 AD, and then he retired to live a monastic life, and he was ordained to assist the aged bishop of Hippo as a priest, and then he became bishop of Hippo. There is a set of philosophical and theological works. Among the works of Augustine are as follows: the most influential, Contra Academicus, against academicians; On Free Choice of the Will; On the Teacher; Confessions, that is kind of autobiography. I recommend to read these book, Confessions. It's a really inspiring text. On the Trinity, on the City of God, and the Reconsiderations. Let's make a brief account of some of the ideas of Augustine. First of all, in one of his works, Augustine offers an argument for the existence of God. And this argument is structured in according to the stages of his own personal ascent to God. This argument can be reconstructed, the lines of this argument can be reconstructed as follows. Augustine tries to convince his interlocutor Evodius, who doesn't believe in God, of the fact that, first of all, we should somehow recognize that there is something in our reality which is really indicative of the supernatural reality, the reality of some eternal, transcendent truth identified with God. First, X is God if and only if X is more excellent than our minds, and nothing is more excellent than X. Truth exists and is more excellent than our minds. For example, mathematical truth is more excellent than our minds. We don't invent the rules of mathematical calculation and logical inference. It seems that we are informed with the knowledge of these rules. We are given, we are taught, as if the truth which is transcendent, which exists over and above our mind, becomes accessible to us due to our education. The truth exists, and the truth is something which is objective. And this objective truth is more excellent than our minds. From these two premises, Augustine concludes that something is God. God exists. Either nothing is more excellent than truth, so that since truth is more excellent than our minds, truth itself is God. Or else something is more excellent even than truth, in which case it is God. The proof's purpose is to put his interlocute avoidus in position to know and understand what he formerly merely believed. According to Augustine, faith demands completion in understanding. Believing is a really necessary state of mind. And without believing, our everyday life would be impossible. But Augustine treated believing as a form of knowledge, which is inferior to understanding. Faith demands completion in understanding, and Augustine believed that many of the truths of Christianity could also be understood. That is, seemed to be true on the basis of reason. Not all, but many. Philosophically minded believers therefore can properly apply reason, philosophical analysis and argument, and believers who undertake reasoned investigation of theological matters, however, must start from and be guided by the antecedent assent to the truth of Christian doctrine. This should be obtained prior to any reasoned investigation. According to Augustine, the understanding of religious truth can be treated by analogy with the knowledge of immutable, eternal truths. Augustine discovered, and this is a typical and a clear indication of Platonic influence. Augustine discovered that there is a set of truths, intelligible objects, a set of truths that are subjected to understanding, and the understanding can be attained without any mediation of the senses. Intellectual truths, truths of mathematics, truths of moral judgments, some values. These truths are now assumed to be a priori truth, something which is known a priori. Some objective and necessary truth, not contingent, not empirical truths. The truth of mathematical rules and rules of logical inference, as well as the truth of moral judgments. They are not dependent on contingent empirical facts. They are not invented by, arbitrarily invented by ourselves. These truths have the properties of being universal, necessary, immutable. They can be revealed by intellectual sight or intellectual vision. Theoria in Greek. Yeah? Now let's turn to Augustine's doctrine of illumination, because it is this doctrine in which Augustine explained how these truths, which are universal, necessary, and immutable, can be known. And the highest among this truth is the truth that God is real. Augustine's doctrine of divine illumination is an extension of the Platonic metaphor of intellectual vision. Augustine maintains that knowledge of immutable eternal truths rests on divine illumination, and our intellectual vision of these intelligible objects depends on their being highlighted or illumined by an intelligible light, truth itself. And Augustine identifies truth with the necessary, immutable, and eternal God. That's why he asserts that knowledge of truth rests on divine illumination. So let's consider some of the tenets of this doctrine of divine illumination. We can see that Augustine was under the influence of Plato and Platonic tradition. Augustine accepts some premises of the Platonic argument for a priori knowledge. First, the ideal notion of knowledge. Knowledge is fixed, immutable. If I know something, the object of my knowledge must be fixed. It is not something which is contingent, which is subjected to any change or transformation. Knowledge can be of something which is fixed, and that what marks the difference between knowledge and opinion. As just recall Plato and his doctrine of knowledge. The objects of knowledge are ideas or ideal forms, immutable, fixed, unchangeable. And the objects, material things that belong to this realm of material cosmos, the realm of material objects, they are the objects of opinion, not the objects of knowledge. So, the first, the ideal notion of knowledge. Knowledge is fixed, immutable. The ideal notion of the objects of knowledge leads to the recognition of the fact that the objects of knowledge must be fixed and immutable too. They must be ideal things, forms, or some ideal structures, if we are justified in using these classical Platonic terms. Any knowledge is of ideals, ideal forms, of standards. The objects of knowledge are the constituents of some ideal reality, and therefore they are divine, because these objects, they have the properties that meet the standards of the properties of true reality, which is divine reality, immutable, necessary, universal. These are the properties of the objects of knowledge, of a priori knowledge, the properties of truths. But the truths which are necessary, immutable, universal, eternal, they are just like windows into the transcendent world. Through the knowledge of these immutable, eternal, and necessary truths, we perceive reality, the true reality, the divine reality, because these are the attributes of the divine reality, to be eternal, to exist necessarily, and so on. Third, the principle of acquaintance. We form knowledge of and only of those things with which we are directly acquainted, the things we come into direct contact with. Later on, Bertrand Russell discriminated between knowledge by acquaintance, and the objects of acquaintance must be real anyway. For instance, if I knock on this table, so I feel that I'm acquainted with the sound, I'm acquainted with the sensory data. And another kind of knowledge, which was identified by Bertrand Russell in the beginning of the 20th century, was the knowledge by description, propositional knowledge. We can know lots of things even without getting in contact with those things, simply by description. You may just describe a certain person, though I may not be acquainted with this person, but I can gain knowledge of this person through a set of descriptions. And this may be not a real person, but something which is imagined. But Augustine insists on the value of the principle of acquaintance. The true knowledge is that which is based on the direct acquaintance, the direct contact. Then, the fourth, the principle of an object being present to the mind in person, not by proxy, not by mediator. All knowledge requires its object to be present to the mind in person. And our knowledge of purely intelligible objects and truth rests on our direct acquaintance with them. And what marks the difference between Augustine's doctrine and the doctrine of Plato, the Platonic doctrine of recollection? According to Plato, the knowledge of ideal forms is not accessible to us in this life. We simply recollect what we have already seen and contemplated while being disembodied souls making our way somewhere out there in transcendent reality of ideal forms and enjoying the contemplation of their ideal forms. Then our souls, they got just enfleshed, and this a priori divine knowledge is forgotten, and the subsequent process is that of the recollection of what we have already seen. But according to Augustine, the direct knowledge and the direct contact with these intelligible divine objects is open to us in this life. Then goes the metaphysical principle of the hierarchy of being, the principle of order and justice, the principle that the lower things cannot act on the higher. And there is an ontological assumption in this system of thoughts. There is, first of all, the view of reality as being hierarchically structured. Augustine holds the view of reality as hierarchical arrangement of things. God is the highest degree of reality. God is at the top of the hierarchy of being. God is that which is truly is. That is why Augustine addresses God and refers to God using the term ipsum esse, being in itself. Yeah? The things lower on the hierarchy are not so real and not so good. They exist in a dependent and contingent way. Another principle is that of supreme justice. God is just. God has arranged things so that the higher have power over the lower. God gives higher things power over the lower, and the lower is subject to the higher. That is the principle of order and justice, the claim that the lower doesn't act on the higher. So let's now combine these ontological implications with the epistemological implications of the principle number 5, that the lower doesn't act on the higher. Knowledge is fixed, immutable, and the objects of knowledge are immutable too. So what about the knowledge of ideals, of standards, of divine ideas? Immutable truths such as divine ideas are the items of supreme reality. These are the windows to the transcendent world. We look through these divine ideas, we look through the ideas of logical inference, through mathematical relations, through the principles of moral judgment, and these truths are necessary, invariant, eternal, and universal, and they serve as the windows through which we just perceive the objective reality, the reality of something which is divine. So the human intellect, in fact, is imperfect. It is a creature. We got the knowledge of immutable truths, but our intellect is imperfect. On the principle that the lower doesn't act on the higher, it follows that creatures, imperfect creatures, cannot act on the divine ideas. We cannot just reach up and grasp the divine ideas, since that would violate the hierarchical arrangement of the universe, because these divine ideas, they are the items of the supreme reality, something which is higher, and we are imperfect. But nevertheless, the knowledge of those ideas is accessible to us. How to explain this fact? And Augustine introduces the concept of divine illumination. We are illuminated by God. The lower doesn't act on the higher. Nevertheless, the knowledge of immutable truths, the truths of mathematics, logic, and moral judgment are accessible to us. How is it possible? We're imperfect. We cannot reach out and grasp these ideas. The only way out of this problematic situation is to assume that this knowledge is accessible to us due to the fact that we are illuminated, that it somehow comes to us. We don't have the power to produce in ourselves a knowledge of those truths. Nevertheless, this knowledge is somehow produced in us by something high, but something which is ontological, on the ontological high level of reality. We don't do it, it is done to us, and that process is exactly what is called illumination. Illumination. So, and one of his work, Augustine begins by establishing a hierarchy that sorts into general categories and then ranks relative to one another the natures that comprise the universe. That's an ontology of Augustine. The nature, first of all, that merely exists, that is not, that doesn't have any potentiality for life. The nature that merely exists and neither lives nor understands ranks below the nature that not only exists but also has the potentiality for being alive and actualizes this potentiality. So something which simply exists, just like stone, but then goes a living being, an organism, which has the potentiality for being alive. But then this next degree of reality in this hierarchy is represented by creatures who are not merely alive but also capable of understanding, because being alive is better than merely just being a stone without any capability or any potentiality for life. But being capable of understanding, reacting to the external environment is better than merely being alive. To be human is really better than being an animal. And there is a nature that ranks above the rational mind, a nature whose characteristic mark is that of being divine. And that is a kind of ontological model. It underlies the exposition of the stages of Augustine's own intellectual ascent to God. What are these stages? And that's an argument. This can be exposed as a kind of argument for the recognition of the reality of God. Augustine, first of all, turns his attention to bodies. That is the first and lowest category in the hierarchy. Then, according to the principle that to be alive is better than just to merely just be real as an inanimate thing, and what brings life into the body? This is the soul. Yeah, this the principle of animation of the corporeal entity. So that's why Augustine, just moving up the stages of this hierarchy, turns his attention from bodies to the soul, the nature constitutive of both the second and third categories. Then he explores his own soul, and within his own soul he turns attention from the sensory part, a part found in both human beings and non-human animals, to reason, a kind of head or eye of our soul which doesn't belong to the nature of non-human animals. So that means that there is a kind of hierarchy in our soul. Some sensory part which we share with animals, and reason which we do not share with animals. Then Augustine focuses on reason's distinctive perceptual capacities and the distinctive sorts of objects they put us in contact with, the objects of pure thought. Augustine observes that those objects must be incorporeal, immutable, independent of our minds. These entities and truths are immutable standards to which our minds must conform. Once again, we do not invent the rules of mathematics. We simply follow these rules. They are given to us. Therefore they are used as standards against which we evaluate our mathematical judgments, for instance. Hence, they must be higher than our reason, those truths of mathematics, logic, morality. Since all the intelligible objects are immutably true, there must be a single thing, immutable truth itself, shared in common by them all. And immutable truth itself is the one in which the many share or are contained. And this immutable truth itself is identified with God. That is a typical Augustinian assent to God. Okay, now we have to stop here because we have run out of time. Yeah? Actually, Augustine also turned to the problem of time. And it is due to the Augustine that we began thinking of time, of the temporary properties of objects. What is time? Yeah? How do we discriminate between different phases of time? We have run out of time. What does it mean? Yeah, can you think of this fact? What does it mean to run out of time? Does it mean that what has happened to us now belongs to the past? Yeah? Or simply there is no place for the further action? Yeah? Within the boundaries of what is pre-established as the plan of our activity. Окей, так, все у нас, да, время вышло.